Hey folks, this introduction is actually recorded about a week after the talk was given and recorded, since I messed up and did not manage to start the recording quite at the point when I wanted to. However, you are getting essentially all of Heather's talk except for the first couple of seconds, really. So I am Vilja Holden. I am at the History Department at CU Boulder. And it is my very great pleasure to introduce a talk by Heather Froehlich, who is assistant professor and literary informatics librarian at Penn State. She got her doctorate from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and she is, as probably all of you know, a Shakespeare scholar, as well as somebody who collaborates on all kinds of projects from the early modern to the present day. She's also currently at work on an edited collection. She's co-editor on an edited collection called Revealing Meaning, Feminist Methods in Digital Scholarship, which sounds very interesting. So without further ado, I give you Heather Froehlich.
Because this work truly could not happen without them. And so we have three different groups of people here. We have Alexis Amico and Amanda Pickett, Hannah Pinson, Caitlin Wert, Alex Kenderly and Marissa Nicosia, Christina Ryman Murphy. This is one project. Racine Amos, D'Angelo Bridges, Denise Berger, Sabrina Evans, Adrina Eiffel, Lopez D. Matthews, Wendy Liz Martinez, Courtney Murray, Justin Smith, Eunice Toe, Christopher D. E. Willoughby, Shirley Moody Turner, and Jim Casey. This is another project. And again, Shirley Moody Turner and Cynthia Young is going to represent a third project. As you can see, Shirley is very much stuck with me. Okay, how do I go forward? There we go. So we're going to talk about three questions of transcription, data, and metadata today, focusing on three projects I've been doing at Penn State in all of its various formats. For those of us who are unfamiliar with the Penn State system, there are either 24 or 26 campuses. This is a number I always get wrong. I serve, as my position as literary informatics librarian, I serve all 24 or 26 of them, depending on how you choose to count those. And many of these have been in collaboration with groups such as Penn State Abington, Penn State, Howard University, Princeton University, and again, Penn State sort of writ large. So yeah, I'm going to basically talk about these three projects today and how I see digital methods being able to deliver on this promise of social history in the digital age. And in doing so, I'm going to touch on some projects that digital humanities scholarship faces in light of doing this work. And so I'm going to start with social history. And from what I understand, and I'm not actually a historian, though I like to play one on the internet and kind of hope and desire very much that you guys will all take me seriously as one, is that it originates in the study of the British working classes, but obviously extends to a lot of different contexts. And we hear a lot about upper and middle class individuals in history, but for this talk, I want to think about individuals who are not predominantly white, male, upper class. And one of the things I think has made history really interesting in this domain is the idea of oral history, thinking about how, for example, we can get sort of everyday lives in conversation and be able to think about what that looks like in practice. Again, public history is doing something kind of similar. Okay, so I trained as a linguist, and I'm very interested in how language functions to show features of variation and change over time. So I'm most familiar with the idea of social history as part of Terttu Nevalainen and Helena Ramulin-Brunberg's work as it applied to the corpus of early English correspondence, or the SEEK from the 90s, which is a real landmark digital project in socio-historical linguistics. And as a side note, a very tremendous resource for thinking about language variation and change in early modern England. So this daunting table is based off of Peter Laslett's The World We Have Lost, England Before the Industrial Age, 1983. And we see a very complex way to think about class and hierarchy here. This is in the days apparently before we had very robust resources such as Adobe Photoshop. So this is how we used to make charts, it seems. So you see that we have divisions of gentry, noblemen, gentlemen, professions, and then there's a kind of category called everyone else that you could see here, which covers yeomen, husbandmen, craftsmen, laborers, cottagers, and paupers don't even get numbers, so I guess they really don't matter. That's exciting. And you'll see in my next slide that they try to simplify this significantly in their new table 11 from 1996. And they have come up with 4 models to kind of account for this. And one thing that is kind of worth noting is that in this one, they add royalty. We're not included in the previous slides. And you may in fact notice that these 4 models now allow for the inclusion of more diverse voices in this corpus that they're trying to build. And that they're no longer trying to describe every status rank, but rather account for where people could fall, which offers a lot more flexibility. And I introduce all of this just to say that there are many ways to think about people beyond the upper classes, and I think that digital methods have tremendous power to allow us to focus in on some of these questions. Okay, now the biggest myth of the digital age is that everything is digitized and accessible, and this, as some of you may have noticed, is not exactly the case. What you are looking at here is a picture of a digitization suite from a place in California that does preservation quality scanning and is the source of how many of the digital collections that you may regularly access are made. It does look this cool in real life, by the way. And if we are ever allowed back in our universities and institutions, I highly recommend that you inquire into the existence of this place, because it is really fascinating to kind of see what goes on behind the scenes to make your digital books and whatnot happen. Okay, and I want to kind of stress that it is really a more complex system than it may seem, but I also want to say that there's lots of places that these digitized materials go. And you are looking at a list of places that I personally, me, myself, Heather Froehlich, have gotten materials from in the past. This is not fully a complete list, I am sure. Now, one of the things that makes these really interesting is that some of these are library vendors. For example, JSTOR, ProQuest, LexisNexis, Adam Matthews. Some of these are more collective works, such as Happy Trust. To a lesser extent, things like ProQuest, Google Books. Some of these are bespoke libraries. I saw Owen Williams here earlier. Folger Shakespeare Library is represented. Some of these are national libraries of the Trove National Library of Australia, the Library of Congress, Europeana collections. Okay, these are all kind of collections of materials based on certain national archives, yes. We also have collections of materials that are sort of aggregated and sold back to us as libraries, including ProQuest and Gale and JISC on this list. And we also have materials that are sort of aggregated on a more local level, including DPLA, OCLC, and Content DM. For those of us who work in libraries, you may be familiar with those. IIIF is also another way of presenting at-home materials. I'm missing a couple here, but you kind of get the idea, right? Like there's lots of different kinds of these digitized materials. Now, one thing that you may have noticed about using these resources is that they are either all full or partial access repositories of printed material based on libraries providing materials and data to them. And they're not always in machine readable formats, which kind of limits some of the possibilities for scholarship. But again, I know that this is really dependent on institutional funding. But the remainder of this talk is really going to focus on some of the ways that social history relies on additional interventions from researchers wanting to use these kinds of collections before we can do anything particularly useful and or interesting. And so now I have to go and define digital humanities, everyone's favorite thing. I think of digital humanities as a methodological toolkit for the studies of humanities data. And I think of this very much as ways of doing in humanities scholarship and borrows from other disciplines like social sciences and, bioinformatics, geoinformatics, things like that. My title, for example, literary informatics librarian, pulls on those things. Okay, so the promise has basically been we can mine all these collections, hooray, but really what can these methods tell us about people who are less studied? This is a real opportunity, I think. And again, in my realm of quantitative textual analysis, we've really kind of focused on the great white men of canonicity, major writers, 15th century to the present day, major figures. We love them. They're really well known. They're really easy to kind of focus on. Now, at this point, I want to stress that all this information isn't absent or not in existence. In fact, that is not the case at all. We have a really rich sense of social history through access to thousands of documents, and even more so when talking about the past 200 years or so. They are just underrepresented compared to the masses of materials related to more famous men of history. So for example, we've seen a huge boom in the interest in women's writing in the past 30 years. Historically Black colleges and universities have significant holdings related to the history of African Americans. And a lot of these materials end up getting collected under the guise of them being affordable and or ephemera, which is occasionally a nice way of saying, well, we don't really know why this matters, but it's cheap and we might buy it. Let's call it a catch-all term. And this is to say nothing about the various local, statewide, and probably national governmental records that exist related to the history of not high prestige people. And I think there's a really rich source of study here. But often we need to think about some intervention before we can get the really exciting, juicy stuff about these kinds of projects. And the rest of this talk is going to focus on some of these interventions. And I begin with project number 1, What's in a Recipe, Penn State, Abington, which is a study run by several undergraduates working with me, Marissa Nicosia and Christina Ryman Murphy. You can see their names here. This is a book called VB 380, as we know it, based on its shelf mark at the Fulcher Shakespeare Library. It is the English cookery and medicine book that seems to have been owned by Hannah Woolley and read by a woman named Anne Western. It is from around 1677. It lives at the Fulcher Shakespeare Library. It's been worked on with some students at Abington. Okay, this is a project where we have sent our students to transcribe pages of this book. You can see a sample page of what happens when you go to transcribe.folger.edu. Which takes you to their transcription platform called Dromio, as in the two twins of comedy of errors, so two hands. We'll talk a little bit more about transcription in the next section and some of the theory behind it, but I think this is a really nice and easy introduction to how this kind of plays out. These are publicly available digital images. You can contribute to public knowledge using this digital platform. You're greeted with a picture and a little green box that you can see here. And you're basically told to write what you see, and there's some guidance provided. And so students at Penn State Abington have been assigned chunks of the text to transcribe, and they become our living experts of this volume. So you can see one of their transcriptions here for cracknels. I am not super certain what these are, even having read this recipe a whole bunch of times. I have some questions, but nonetheless, this is the kind of recipe that you might see, and you might see these kinds of interventions, such as a cross out for salt to fresh butter. Some of the italicisms can be recorded. There seems to be two hands based on the colors, and you can see from the fact that Word is very unhappy with how we are spelling boil and boiled that we have not asked our students to modernize. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting and really useful about this is that the students become experts in their own transcriptions, right? Like we've assigned them X number of transcriptions and they really engage very deeply with them. And so one of the things we've been doing is we've been then asking them to kind of analyze this and think about how their transcriptions compare and contrast to each other. So let's say your 40 recipes look different than mine. What does that look like in practice? So here we see a voyant screenshot from the whole class corpus as of last spring. And from what I understand, the students seem to like this sort of bird's eye view of their work because it let them think about how their transcriptions compared to another. So for example, if Vilya's section had lots to do with pastry and mine had lots to do with meat, that might end up showing up quite clearly here. Okay, but what we're looking at here is the full student transcriptions. This is the entire class corpus of the whole book. And you can see in the sort of word cloud to my left-hand side, which I think might be your right-hand side, you see words like make, pound, little, water, butter, half, good, th, yes? Okay, great. In the middle, you can see the whole class corpus itself. On the right, we have a very scary looking graph, which we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about. But we also have the ability to look at some keyword and context and kind of see how these words are actually used in practice. And we get some facts about the transcriptions. Okay, and so we end up talking to our students about some of the ingredients. You can see them quite large here, including water, sugar, butter, and words that they have noticed as readers and transcribers, which end up being comparatively less important. And so this is a nice reminder that humans are good at things that stand out and less good at things that are sort of everywhere. And of course, the pound of butter versus pound the butter offer two very different meanings of pound. So, you know, there's a little bit more going on behind the scenes other than, ooh, look pretty. Okay, now one way to engage with these questions is to try cooking some of them. So with apologies to the Bon Appetit test kitchen, here we are in the Acura test kitchen. And this kind of foregrounds what it does to tell us about women's labor when we do this kind of work. And it puts a real focus on what women are doing, not just the sort of verbs and nouns, but also the physical element of making these recipes. So this is a way of thinking about women's work as part of the maintenance of home life, right? Like how do we feed the family? What are we eating? What does that look like? In this case, these recipes can cover everything from custard tarts, which are pictured here, to more medicinal recipes covering a real range of household activities. Interestingly, as a quick side note, some of our students were very shocked to see ingredients like arsenic and lead showing up in some of these medicinal recipes, going, why would they do that? And this is a clever reminder to point out that there are reasons that some people are dead. And, you know, we have made many advancements in science, especially in the moment of COVID-19, to keep this slightly lighthearted. Okay, Moving right along to Transcribe Cooper. This has been in collaboration with the Color Conventions Project for Douglas Day 2020. Some of you may have participated, and if you have, thank you very much. This is a focus on the African-American scholar and activist Anna Julia Cooper, who is best known for her classic 1892 text, A Voice from the South. She earns her PhD from the Sorbonne at age 66 and becomes an advocate for education for African-Americans in Washington, D.C. And this, for us, is a very nice long case study in linguistic terms. You know, she lives a long, full life doing lots of different things, gives us lots to work with. Okay, so her materials have existed digitally at Howard University. They've been scanned, but they're not all really fully accessible in this way. Her handwritten materials, such as correspondences and paperwork, scrapbook and multimodal materials, memorabilia, you know, these things are all sort of aggregated different kinds of materials that are really hard to work with in a sort of digital domain. Now, the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project has been interested in transforming these materials into more multimodal, more robust kinds of digital materials. And so here we see that the students are using a platform called Zooniverse, which is again another transcription portal. And I should note that there are several of these for those of us who are unaware. And the grad students working with us really built this project out from the ground up. We gave them the platform. Well, actually, Jim Casey gave us the platform. We watched the students sort of develop it out, and we watched what the choices they made about this. And so in the end, they kept a whole bunch of classifications that the Howard Archives had already produced for us. And you know, there's many good reasons to do this, but one of the reasons that they made really quite clear to us is that they weren't really sure where the project would go, and they wanted to be as sort of wide-ranging as possible. But it also opens some really tricky ontological wormholes. So what makes something a clipping versus notes versus unsorted? What's an original letter versus correspondence? Manuscripts and addresses might also offer coverage of manuscripts in the Grimke book, for example. So these are all classifications that you could have clicked on and then gone off and done some work for us on. Now, I'm not here to say that the students have made a mistake, and in fact, I don't think so. I think they've made some really interesting choices about what to do with this kind of material. There are many ways of handling this data, and when it comes from somewhere else, and sometimes you just have to trust what's being given to you, the same way that you go to a physical archive and they go, oh yes, this is box 1, this is box 4, this is box 3. They have these things in them. So, you know, it also gives us a way of thinking about how these choices can then dictate what's possible much later on down the line, which is something we're still not truly sure about, which is important. And so I think there's a lot of ways that we can develop new directions for this project through this process, and thinking about what makes Anna Julia Cooper's writing unique. How do we see variation in her writing based on style, form, and audience? But before all of that, we really have to do some engagement to structure the interface to collect this information. So our student collaborators, under the leadership of Justin Smith at Penn State, worked to design the interface to collect several stages of metadata about the documents, as you can see here. This one is a form of some kind that has printed material and handwritten material. So over here on my right, maybe your left, it says, does this document contain anything that is typed and written, both or neither? And for this one, you would choose both, and it would then set up some further questions about what you would do with these things. Blah, 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 where was I? Oh, yes. And so we can be asked to transcribe the handwritten and typed information. We would then be able to parse them out equally in this case. And by the way, we did finish. Thank you all of us who did do a little bit of transcription for us. We ended up getting 3 people to transcribe every document. And so one of the reasons we did this is in case multiple people make the same choices, we can start to aggregate those. So for example, if one person says one thing, someone else says the same thing, and someone else says something completely different, maybe we can go cross-reference the first 2 and find out what the thing might say. And I'm going to show you that in 1 second. With this example, this is a letter from Anna Julia Cooper to Mr. A.G. Cummings of Oberlin, Ohio. Those of us who are very interested in it can follow the link at the bottom here, which is dh.howard.edu, AJC chorus /22. And as you can see, this is a really nice digitized object. It has very clear handwriting. You can see pretty much what it says very easily. It has some interesting little annotations here and there. But overall, this is a pretty great archival document. We like these. Historians, I think, are really into these. And so here is it as transcribed by not logged in BOB 26B 9C 72E 36D 69B DBO. Please log in when we ask you to do these things. It makes our lives easier. Anyway, what you can see here is that this is the exact file as it comes back to us from the Zooniverse platform. And for those of us who care very deeply about different kinds of file types, this is in JSON, and you can see here's our question. Does the document contain any writing that is typed, handwritten, both, or neither? This person says it is handwritten. Is any of the text legible? Yes, okay. And they go through and start to transcribe. Okay. RJ Boutel does the same thing and comes up with slightly different accounts of this, not fully different, not fully wrong. I think all these could be very reasonable. And you can see again, it looks very much like the previous one we just saw. Longerette comes by, and thank you all three of you, by the way. If you are watching, I'm very grateful for you, and I also very much like your usernames. You can see that this person has a couple unclears, put some slashes in. There's a couple extra things. So suddenly we have three versions of the same document that we can kind of look through and try to come up with a best case version of it. And I've done that here for you. And I'm not convinced that I'm necessarily doing it right, but I looked at all three transcriptions and compared them line by line and said, okay, what is most likely the outcome? And here we have to Mr. A.G. Cummings, Oberlin, Ohio. Dear Mr. Cummings, I am sorry I cannot enter wholeheartedly into the campaign for downing Governor Smith. My own vote, it is true, if I had one, should go to Hoover as the man coming nearer of the two to representing the best in American ideals. But personally, the 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution are just as precious in my sight as the 18th. Okay, you can see that this is a little bit more digitally friendly to computational approaches such as machine learning, quantitative text analysis, this sort of thing, than the previous iterations that we've just seen, I hope. Okay. And, you know, I think this also makes a pretty clear case that you can use this in a lot of other ways that we couldn't have used the other versions of the same letter. And so in the interest of time and for the real hope for discussion here, I'm going to move onwards to a third project related to African-American collections as data with Dr. Shirley Moody Turner and Dr. Cynthia Young. And so I've been thinking a lot about the idea of collections of text as data, in the sense that a corpus is a large collection of machine-readable texts, as we've just seen, to be analyzed for linguistic features. And these are collected systematically, and they ask questions like, what texts? Why these texts? So if we were to look backwards at some of the other projects we've just talked about, you know, here are all of Anna Julia Cooper's writings. Why, what texts? Already answered. Why these texts? Well, she's the first African-American activist. She's one of the major African-American activists. She's one of the first African-American women to get her PhD. She's very involved in the African-American life of Washington, D.C. Okay, those are good justifications. For BB380, you know, you can say this is one recipe manuscript that covers an entire landscape of how a family may have eaten, what they may have consumed, what that looks like. Why these texts? Well, we can start to potentially think about them in connection to other recipe manuscripts of the same period, for example. In corpus construction, just to say, corpus can cover all the works of a particular author, and here I'm thinking about Dickens' books, all the works of a particular subgenre, such as the court records of the Old Bailey, all the works of a population of authors, such as the Enron corpus, for something more recent in history, and a sample of every mention of a particular concept, such as a corpus of Hurricane Harvey tweets, which is, by the way, something else I've done with some colleagues at Penn State in communications here. And I think these all raise some interesting questions if we start to consider these alongside the idea of collection management, right? Like, who do we collect? Why do we collect them? And what do we do with them? So we also have we also have questions of balance, including age, gender, location, social background, written and or spoken data, dialect, and you can see that these start to look a lot more like the sort of social history questions that we're very interested in as historians. Okay, so we approach this question with Happy Trust. Clearly is a really good place to begin here. There are theoretically loads of digitized and printed data material to work with, but of course, for those of us who are really up with the discussions here, we know that Bode 2020's review of Ted Underwood really pushes at this idea of everything is digitized and therefore we are representing everything here. That said, we thought it was a really interesting thing to kind of think about Black women's activism as an early 20th century kind of action and activity. And we came up with these parameters. By the way, I know that this is the least sexy version of a spreadsheet you've ever seen, but I want to kind of stress that there's not much I could do without writing it all down in the first instance, right? Like I want to be able to keep referencing this over and over again, and I didn't want to lose it to the depths of my computer or to a notebook that I would, or to a loose sheet of paper I'd never see again. Like I want to keep it somewhere where I could see it and engage with it. And so we developed the below parameters. We chose certain themes, certain activities, including format like archive, conference, journal, manuscript, microform, mixed material, newspaper, you know, and you can see that I start to come up with some challenges. No results match my search. Okay, revise to remove the keyword activism. Now we have 51 catalog results, and here are some examples to kind of follow up on. As Vilja pointed out, my background has been in early modern print culture and gender studies more generally, so I was a little bit out of my depth, but I was very grateful for my collaborators a couple days later when I showed up with, okay, this one looks promising. I have some examples. This, and you can see I said promising with 2 exclamation points. I was very pleased with myself. We have a bunch of examples. We have a whole bunch of things that look relevant. I'm not the expert here, but I think this looks pretty good. And, you know, there was lots of trial and error. There's like 4 pages between this page and this page in my notes, just so you know. I saved you the effort of having to look at all of those. But when Shirley and Cynthia looked at this, they were both like, wow, that is very masculine. And I was really struck by this because I would never have noticed that without their intervention, because to me, the non-expert here is like, wow, this is a really robust sense of what African-American activism could have been like. Cool. And again, when I started to think about sampling, this becomes really hard to do when the scales are so skewed in this particular direction. Again, thinking about Catherine Bode's criticism of Ted Underwood's new book, Distant Horizons, this is something that comes up over and over again in this idea of large-scale quantitative analysis, that we're going to be able to pull everything and it's going to be representative of all the things we needed to. Which is not, as you can see, not necessarily true when Shirley and Cynthia come up and go, wow, this is very masculine. This made us pivot to some new kinds of research questions, including who do we choose to privilege when the available digitized printed record looks like this? What does it say about historical memory when we are especially skewed towards men's writing, even in the sort of latter days of history, more recent history? How do we even account for women's voices under these circumstances? And is it possible to? And one of the pleasant surprises about doing this kind of work is that sometimes the initial research question goes away and something much more interesting can come up. So, for example, what can we learn about the history of activism as it is presented to us through an interface like HappyTrust? Are there specific journals that we could request to be added to this running list of materials? Who has them? Could they be digitized? Could they be added? What would that look like? Are there ethic problems involved? Things like that. And more interestingly, from my perspective, though less so for I think Shirley and Cynthia's, can we identify a baseline for Black men's activist literature and then think about women's activist literature on top of that? You know, what does that mean in practice? So I want to kind of rush to some very light conclusions so we can start to discuss a little bit more as a group, because I see that there's lots of you. I want to start by saying that I think digitized resources are really rich with opportunities, but they're not quite ready for the sort of plug and play that we see being advertised in DH just yet. And I think there are some 3 new problems that I would like us to all think about for the rest of this discussion. One of them is curatorial, thinking about collection management, taking on new forms in digital projects, but still focused on questions of whose materials, how, why, and when. Managerial questions, such as those of stewardship more generally, such as who is in charge of access, what does that look like, how do vendors of digital collections and library-supported digital collections interact? Are they going to always be sort of divided? Can we think about how to bring those walled gardens a little bit closer together? Is that even possible? I'm not super sure. And then finally, historical. From what I can tell, I kind of gather that historians have really liked archival studies, and they really enjoy the act of engaging with primary source materials, even in the dreaded cliometric studies. And I wonder if we think that this takes us really far away from those discussions, or if it opens new ones for the field. And if we're worried that making these transformations of these materials produces a new loss, or if it changes the entire world for historians more generally. So I'd like to close and invite questions, comments, and concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So that was an awesome talk. And I'm going to open it up for questions. And again, if you raise your hand if you click on participants and raise your hand, I can let you speak. Otherwise, you can put in questions in chat. And we already have one from Owen Williams. When we are constructing a corpus, how should we define a genre or a subgenre? Should we allow an impersonal corporate identity, like the Old Bailey, define what falls inside the genre, subgenre boundary? And so, because there's a worry that following historical genres to do that work might select against previously marginalized groups because they might not produce in canonical genres.
That's a great question, Owen. I think one of the ways to get around this is having multiple people try to categorize stuff together, with the idea that, for example, if Owen says this is one thing and Billia says this is another thing, and Heather says it's a third thing, how do we then reach an agreement on what those three different people say? Again, the principle of three. How do we kind of get those people to agree on these things? That's one way of dealing with it. I think another way of dealing with it is trying to use bibliographical terms as much as possible, in the sense of there is a certain level of description that comes with, for example, Library of Congress classifications or less popular Dewey classifications. I think there's ways around this that can kind of be used to our advantages. And I also think that being astute about the kinds of ways that you might want to pull in these questions in the very early stages gives you lots of scope to kind of think through what you want to be able to foreground in generic differences. But I also think it's really a choice that you have to make early on, rather than sort of 3 months down the line when you start classifying stuff and going, oh God, we really should have done more about X, or we really should have done more about Y. I think you have to be really particular about it early on.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to raise their hand? Don't be shy.
I don't bite, I'm all the way over here.
All right, so here's one in chat. Michaela Ardizzoni, I'm wondering if Heather could say a little bit more about the challenges of conducting social media analysis using the tools/approaches she highlighted today. Are there specific programs we should use or avoid for this kind of research?
Can I ask a clarifying question of this person? I'm sorry. By software and tools, do you mean sort of approaches to choosing the software, or are you thinking more about what kind of collections we should be aiming ourselves at? Or are you thinking of both of those?
Both.
Both, okay. Well, one of those is easier to answer than the other for sure. I think that we should be very conscious of the kinds of materials that we are thinking about from a provenance perspective. Where did the materials come from? How did we get access to them? What did they look like? One thing that we learned very quickly in the Happy Trust project was that although most of the materials come from universities, they don't always have the full collection of materials. They might have a couple years here, a couple years there, things like that. So, for example, the NAACP materials covered from, I want to say, 1918 to 1923, and then 1928 to 1932 or something. You know, that's not really a full set, though it would have been nice, you know. So I think really thinking through the sort of provenance of where the materials come from is useful. Digital databases that your university library might buy usually tend to be a little bit more robust, but they also tend to cost a small fortune, which I think is an interesting and unfortunate use of supply and demand in that sense. But it also means that you might be locked into someone else's walled garden of where you could get different kinds of materials and what that might look like. So for example, if you're using Adam Matthews data, you might only be able to use Adam Matthews data, or you might only be able to use materials from JSTOR, stuff like that, depending on what your organization's agreements with these vendors look like. So I don't think that answers your first question, but I think it's really worth thinking more about, and I'm going to do a little bit more thinking about it. In terms of software for analysis in general, I mean, I think you have to choose the right piece of software for the thing you want to do. And I very often come across people who are like, oh, I'm going to topic model this thing to show change over time, which is great, except for the fact that topic modeling doesn't do that. unless you set out every single year of data and pull it out individually and say, in this year this happens, in this year this happens, in this year this happens, and over time we can see these kinds of patterns emerging. And most people tend not to do that, it turns out, largely because that turns out to be very time consuming. So I think we have to choose the right tool for the process. And I think we have to think through very carefully what we want to be able to show versus what we can actually do as well. And that's harder than it sounds, for sure. I'm not sure I answered your question, I'm sorry.
Feel free to ask follow-ups.
Please do.
So Thea's asking, can you talk a little bit about learning outcomes for students, for the students with whom you work on digital projects?
Yeah.
I'll second that question.
Thank you, Thea. Yes. So one of the ways that we kind of pitched this for our students at Penn State Abington has been, you're going to learn about the history of cookery, and we're going to learn about the history of recipes, but we don't explicitly tell them, for example, that they're going to learn paleography outright. We tell them they're going to learn this very cool old book, and we're going to become very, specific experts on it. I know that Marissa and Christina are here, and I know that they feel strongly that we are doing this kind of work, but we're not saying to them, oh, you're also going to know about XML and TEI and these things, because it all kind of happens under the hood for them. In the Anna Julia Cooper project, that was very much at the forefront, where the students signed on to learn how to use the Zooniverse platform and get really engaged and, design something that would let them kind of digest this kind of information in really concrete ways. So I think it goes in both directions. On the one hand, I think we need to be really clear about where it is we want to see the students kind of go and develop their own research interests out of it. But I also am really intrigued by the ways, by sort of saying outright, like, this is what we're going to do, can present really cool opportunities for students to grow and learn within the sort of playground that we give them to work in. So I think there's ways of pitching learning outcomes in ways that are not necessarily, you will learn to do A, B, C, and D technologically, but more along the lines of, you will learn to think around A, B, C, and D.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, okay, here we go. Jenny Smith is saying, thank you all, this is really fascinating and useful. I totally agree with that. Sorry, I'm not really sure if I should be adding my commentary to the question, but I'll just use the privileges of being the host. I was interested in the idea some slides back in project 3 about starting to posit a baseline for the history of, in this case, Black activism. I may be misremembering and wondered if Heather could elaborate on the concept of a baseline for the history of whichever topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was a sort of theoretical, what if we could make that up, right? We don't really have a clear sense of what Black activist literature as a whole looks like, or Black activist materials as a whole look like, sort of in the sense of large scale data analysis. We don't really have the big, pretty word clouds or topic models to tell us these things necessarily, as far as I know. If someone is working on this, please let us know immediately, because I have lots of questions for you. And I think presenting the idea of a baseline and saying, okay, if this is what activist literature of African-American activism more generally looked like in the early 20th century, could we then extrapolate from there what women's Black activist literature might look like, and in ways in which those two may and may not diverge from each other? I think in some ways it is easier to start with the thing that you know than the thing that you don't know. And in this case, for Happy Trust, we can see very clearly that we have a very clear sense of what Black digital literature of this period looks like. We can point at the different journals, we can point at the different materials, say these are them. We can sample them, we can curate them, we can do these things. But within that, what do we know about them? There's still some big questions about that. Does that help?
I think so.
Jenny, does that help you?
So, yes, thank you.
Okay, great.
Chat. So, anybody else? This is like an unusually awkward way of dealing with Q&A. Well, since I'm not seeing anybody's questions at the moment and nobody's raised their hand, I'm just going to go ahead and improvise a question myself. So, what's been your experience with recruiting undergrads? Like, do you try to target, and maybe you said something about this, I'm a little distracted by watching the various screens. But how do you like target particular kinds of undergraduates? Do you try to get people who already have some technical skills, or do you try to get people who have no technical skills who would learn more from this? And also, like, one of the things that we've been talking about in these kinds of sort of project-oriented things is trying to like create some kind of a pyramid structure where you have like the professors and the librarians, and then the graduate students and the undergraduates, and having some kind of sort of vertical as well as horizontal cross-fertilization going on. So if you could just, you know, riff on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not actually qualified to answer that question because I'm not the one choosing the students, right? The students who signed up for Dr. Nicosia's class, Marissa is telling me right here that we've recruited students who are interested in doing research and have no experience in the field and no Renaissance background outright. Thank you, Marissa. But I think there's also the value of kind of pitching this as we're going to learn this thing and you don't know that other people don't do this. You know, we're not presenting this as this thing that is unique or special. We're just kind of being like, we are going to do this thing. It is normal. And we present it as normally as possible, as this is how we're doing stuff. And by the end of it, the students have not seen it as being weird or strange or anything like that, but they just see it as part and parcel of doing this kind of research. And, you know, maybe down the line, they find out that that was a little bit unique, but not necessarily truly they're looking for the sort of DH experience. They're looking for the hands-on research experience. When it comes to the Anna Julia Cooper project, again, I really don't know because I wasn't part of the project when they were recruiting students, but I imagine this came from a class that Dr. Moody Turner ran as a graduate level seminar in women's activist writing. And she was kind of like, we have money, who wants to work on a project with me? And I imagine a whole bunch of people went, oh, me, this is cool. And then they were thrown into this sort of Zooniverse landscape where they learned the entire process of using an interface like the Zooniverse, setting up a digital project, thinking about what kind of materials go in to be ingested to then produce what we see on the other side. I remember very deeply a conversation that we had when we were learning about the Zooniverse, where someone turned to me and goes, is this really all just spreadsheets? And I said, yes. And she goes, God, that's terrible. And I was like, yes, I know. But it was also this sort of moment where she realized like, oh, and the way that this works is really sort of about feeding things in and out. And so because we're not presenting it as you're going to learn about spreadsheets, we're going to talk about how to present a public digital project. Those are two different conversations. So again, it kind of goes back to people who are in the idea of expertise in the field, but also interested in doing the research in the first place. Thank you, Marissa, for your help there.
Thanks. All right, more questions, folks. Don't be shy. There's like 50 of you, nearly 50 of you out there.
I really don't bite.
Oh, okay, so that got some results. All right, from Book Carlson, aloha and mahalo for this wonderful experience. I am thinking about public-facing scholarship and pedagogy and wondering about your experience with these materials in public-facing platforms. Are all of these projects done within a university LMS or behind closed doors? And what are your thoughts about making things in public-facing spaces? And how might that raise ethical questions? And what might be the advantages of public-facing projects?
Okay, this is a great question. The work that we are doing on the Zooniverse platform was very, very intentionally in public, right? Like it was designed for a public audience. We presented it in a way that was very framed towards, hey, students, scholars, teachers of any scale and scope, here's something that you can do with your class for African American History Month. You know, I think that's a really great way of approaching this. For the work we've done with the students at Penn State Abington, it has been a little bit more closed door, but not fully. The students did, with the help of a seed grant, they did a full public exhibition at the Penn State Center in Philly in November of last year, in 2019. And in fact, they are currently doing an undergraduate research sort of program at Penn State Abington, details which I do not have full information of, but I can probably get you if you're interested. And as for the African American Collections as Data project, I'm certainly looking to build a corpus of African American activist literature. It's something I've been working on sort of on and off for the past few months, but I'm also really intrigued by the ways in which I'm not sure when I am ready to take it public, in the sense that I still want to be able to kind of think through what are the curatorial choices I'm making, what does that look like, how do we think about it? what choices are we excluding when we do this? This goes back to Owen's question about genre and sort of definition. What choices do I make when I do include these things? That kind of engagement. And I think it's a push-pull. I mean, I think you have to sort of weigh the safety of yourself and others, but I think you also have to think through, if the project is designed to be a public history or a public-facing scholarship, thinking through what the immediate outcomes could be very long before you actually go live and on the internet in the public domain. I think both of those are worth discussing, and including your students in the conversation too. I mean, they may not want to have their name attached to stuff that goes fully online. They may not want to know that anyone on the internet could go rock up and see their project. And I think you have to respect that just as much as you respect the idea that everything should be open and ready for the world too.
All right, here's another question. So I assume this is this from Hope Saska. I'm assuming this is like depending on what you find in the archives. So how do you address purely visual content like doodles or sketches or collaged images, if that ever comes up? Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely had, for example, in the Anna Julia Cooper project, because this one's really, unique, really close to my mind at the moment. We did this just a couple months ago. The students had a whole bunch, we had a big debate about what we were going to do with postcards, in that they have an image and they might have a little line of text that say, Honolulu, Hawaii, for example. I don't know if Anna Julia Cooper ever went to Hawaii, but you get the idea. And the question was really, do we want to keep them? Do we want the people to transcribe them? What if there's actual information on the back of them? It became this really large, complicated question. And when I did this again in the Hattie Trust data, I found lots of material that was just tabulated numbers and columns. Is that actually helpful? I don't know if that's going to really do me a whole lot of good if I want to set up a text mining project when I know that I'm just going to have a whole bunch of numbers sitting there. But it might be really useful census data for someone else who might be really interested in this. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the other challenges is you have to think through what the user might get out of it too. I mean, if the user is really interested in correspondences for Anna Julia Cooper, for example, and finds herself looking at a whole bunch of postcards that have flowers from Paris on them, maybe that's not what she wanted to see. And is that going to help her and get her to do the buy-in for the public-facing scholarship that we just talked about? I think that's harder to kind of gauge and judge, but ultimately the students made the decision to keep it. And I thought it was actually a really interesting way of thinking through that exact process of going, okay, well, this is correspondence. It is showing a level of engagement with this other person. We just might not get the other person on the other side of that equation.
Okay, so I'm going to fold these two into one. First of all, there's a follow-up from Carlson. Mahalo. Follow-up. Who can we turn to host these DH projects? The cost, the maintenance, the everybody's favorite question. And then there's a question from April Gilbert saying, I appreciate that you foregrounded here the labor done in the crowdsourced projects and that you acknowledge maintenance work. Could you speak about whether/how you also address with your collaborators or students the practice of acknowledging digital labor?
Okay. I'm going to go with the labor question first, then go to the who to host question, if that's okay. Great. So we talk a lot about labor in the projects that I do in many ways because I think that student labor is intrinsic to the work that I do. And every single piece that I've presented to you today is not done by me, right? Like I did very little of this work. I'm here representing the people for whom I have worked with for many months and many years to kind of think through what this looks like in practice. And I really want them to feel like their representation of this work is as owned by them as it is by me. They may not feel that way, but I've been in cases and I've seen presentations where we have some senior person just talking about some work that some graduate students did without acknowledging them, without saying anything about what that looks like. And often once we get to the Q&A, they are very stumped by what happened. And suddenly that becomes very obvious when you realize that the person who is presenting to you knows very little about this project, in fact. And I find that really dispiriting, I think. And so when I talk to my students about the kind of work I'm going to be doing and the ways in which we are engaging with them, there's a lot of discussion, not just of what the project itself is doing, but sort of how we talk about the work that we're doing in collaboration with each other. It's an ongoing discussion. It's presented early on, it's presented in early stages. It's also presented in, ongoing discussions about, okay, well, you did this thing and this person wrote these things, and combined we now have this website, or combined we now have this kind of final product. But I think it's hard, and I think that it's really difficult to do it in a way that feels right to everyone. And I know that there's people who may feel like I should just show up and be like, look at all the work I've done, I'm so great. But I don't know, I think it's hard to really represent that well. And I think that by acknowledging the labor that goes into these projects, it's clear that it's not just one person doing all the things, writing the articles, putting the blog post up, putting the pictures on the internet. It's not all of this, it's many people underneath the surface, and it becomes a sort of iceberg situation. Going back to the question of who to host, which is a little bit harder because that's a different form of labor. You often end up asking some of your collaborators and friends in the libraries to, hey, can you hang on to this project for me? And they might be like, what project? No, we don't have the capacity for this. Or they might be like, oh, that's really cool. I wish you had told me about that like 6 months ago so I could have planned for it. So I think one of the ways to kind of get into the question of hosting and long-term planning is to really think about what the best practices are in your field. Really think about the best practices for long-term planning early on in the project. One of the greatest experiences that I've done in the past few years has been going to Alison Langmead's Socio-Technical Sustainability Roadmap, NEH Institute. You can visit this at, I think, the stsr.pitt.edu or some iteration of that. Go Google this. And it kind of lays out the sort of long-term planning that is necessary for thinking about a digital project and thinking through the ways in which we really sort of deal with those questions early on. What's the expected life cycle? What will that look like? What can we expect to sort of lose down the line? Who are the people that we need to really keep this thing going? What does that look like? Stuff like that. And I think by really setting ourselves up for success in that domain, we can start to think about, so who do we need to ask way before this thing goes online, how long it's going to be there and what it's going to do, and whether or not we really expect it to still be needing a programmer in 10 years, things like that. Marissa has very kindly passed on to Vilja the statement of the Student Collaborators Bill of Rights over here, which is a really useful document, and it's something that I kind of use to foreground how we have these discussions with undergraduates. And I think it's really important to be continuing that in all the other projects that we do too. Thank you, Marissa.
Yeah, thanks. I posted that. Everybody should be able to see that. So yeah, I think overall this question of, I think in some ways, like that whole question of collaboration in itself is really productive to discuss with students, right? And so quite apart from sort of just the sort of check boxes of recognizing everybody's labor, to have that discussion about, okay, so this is how this is how we do collaboration. Like we care about who does the work and contributes, and especially in like social history projects, that seems to me to really integrate nicely with the actual work you're doing, which, I'm a labor historian, and sometimes, you come across situations where you're like, oh, you might like practice what you preach too.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that certainly comes up a lot in these discussions is the ways in which you can ask students to do stuff, but then you have to be careful about what it is you're asking them to do on top of everything else you're doing. You're this much of their lives, this much, realistically. You're not, 98% of their lives, whereas you may feel like you're doing so much and you're so involved in everything that's crucial to their existence, and they might be like, oh my God, no. I think you have to really think about where that balance can live and what that labor balance really looks like. Expectations have to be reasonable rather than unreasonable.
Yeah. Okay, more questions.
Okay, excellent.
No, I'm calling for more questions. Oh. There will be. I'm sure there will be.
Yes, please give me more questions. I'm here for another half hour.
Okay. Let's see. And I could, I think we all are. And again, if you want to like call, if you want to raise your hand, if you'd rather speak your question, you're more than welcome. I can easily unmute you from here. No. Okay. Well, so as we wait for more questions, I guess we can continue talking about collaboration and the ways in which, I don't know. So I know you've described 3 specific projects, but can you say anything about like what kinds of projects you've feel like are particularly well suited for collaboration, or especially for like collaboration in which students are involved?
So I really like these transcription projects as student projects in the sense that they tap in really nicely and they make really nice modules in different kinds of history classes and different kinds of literature classes. You know, women's studies can certainly take on some of these. And they are a way of getting students to engage with archival materials that they may not be able to see in real life. So for example, currently the Library of Congress is doing this really cool 100th anniversary of the 20th Amendment with their women's suffragette collection. They're also doing a transcription project with this. It's a way of getting students to really sort of work with these materials in ways that they may not be able to see in a really sort of clear format that, yeah, it gives them a sort of sense of like, oh, okay, I can go visit these things, I can see these things, I can work with these things. And, you know, you can bring it back into a discussion that looks a little bit more like something that you may have already done in a hands-on, go to the rare books collections library, go to the special collections in your library, go touch some books, go work with some books, see what happens. I think it's a nice way of engaging with these materials when you're many miles away from them. I also think that there's a real value in kind of thinking about the affordances of the digital in this space. Yeah, I mean, you can get students to look at things that they would never be able to see in real life. And maybe down the line that gets them really excited about the idea of working with archival materials later. I don't know, I think it's great. And I think it really kind of plugs in nicely to other existing structures. You know, working with Marissa and Christina, I've seen a lot of ways to get the students really invested in early modern printed books and written books that I don't think the students knew were even accessible to them in the first place. Working with the Anna Julia Cooper materials, you know, when we had Douglas Day, we had entire women's studies classes come and be like, oh, this is so cool, thank you for hosting this. And so I think that gives us a lot of sort of space to kind of engage with these materials. There's a lot of them, you know, there's lots of projects that are asking for crowdsourced resources. And now that we may not be able to go visit any libraries anytime soon, I think it's a really good way of kind of getting them involved.
Yeah.
That was a long answer, sorry.
No, that's totally fine. Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I totally agree with students' excitement about getting to see materials that they didn't realize that they could be able to, like, that they didn't know maybe existed, or they knew that they existed, but they thought that they're like in the basement of a Harvard library they're never going to get to, right? So,
But we
okay.
certainly had a lot of success with the Anna Julia Cooper stuff, where we had a whole bunch of students come and be like, this is so cool, I've never heard of this lady, but she rules. Like, yeah.
Right, exactly, like exactly what you want to hear, right?
Whoever it was who asked about learning outcomes, that alone is a learning outcome, right? Like, here's
Yeah.
someone we've never heard of, but holy shit, she's cool.
Yeah. So here's a question from Rebecca Benson. Do you notice students interacting differently with corpus searches when they have had a chance to do the processing work themselves? I'm interested in how deep involvement can give people different perspectives to use on a broad scale.
Wow, I love this question because I have no idea, but I'm going to hazard a guess here, which is that if you've been involved in the design of a project, you probably know how to search the project pretty well. But I have no evidential evidence for that. Like, I have no idea if that's true in real life, but I would assume the same way that catalogers know how to get everything in the world out of their catalog. People can then really get into this. Christina Ryman Murphy is saying the word sugar to me, something that came up a lot in our early explorations of VB380s, that the students were like, why are we talking about sugar so much? And then suddenly we started to see over and over again that this was a really important piece of our particular manuscript, that it really worked with sugar. So they were able to kind of dig into that by virtue of seeing it at that level. So apparently the answer is yes. I would also hazard to say that, like, if you've been really involved in the sort of markup and design and structure of a corpus, you probably have a pretty clear sense of what it is you want to then get out of it, right? So if you're setting things up for, let's say, age and class, for example, you probably know already how much data related to a certain age group there is, or how much data related to a certain class group there is. And you might be able to kind of hazard some guesses about what your expected annotational evidence might look like.
Yeah, I think that I really like that question too. Okay, so here's one from Megan Welsh. Your
Okay.
postcard example resonated with me. How do you balance gaining expert knowledge that might exist outside of the institution? For example, there is a robust network of philatelists passionate about the ins and outs of postcards, with the initial work of students who may lend a beginner mindset to DH and their own subject knowledge.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
I can. Yes. So the postcard example. And so how do you balance gaining expert knowledge that might exist outside of the institution? For example, there is a robust network of philatelists, with the initial work of students who may lend a beginner mindset to DH and their own subject knowledge.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I didn't catch exactly what you said about the postcards in the first place. Yeah, that's cool. I don't know. Part of me says, you know, there's value in leaving things in to let people explore. And I think discoverability is something really that is important to these kinds of big digitization projects. We need to be able to dig into the data and get stuff out of it that we want to be able to kind of explore and see and really kind of get our way around and feel our way around as users. Something that was really fun about the Anna Julia Cooper project was really getting to see all this archival material kind of laid out in front of me in, again, a spreadsheet, but then being able to say, oh, okay, these are all the postcards. They all look like this. They're all from these years. They're all from those kinds of setups. That's really cool. Okay. But I think also you have to make certain choices that may be upsetting to very involved scholars who want to be able to say, well, here are my postcards, woohoo, I don't care about the rest of it. But really, if there's only like 5 or 6 of them, is it worth keeping them in for that value, or is it worth trying to think about what's happening in terms of the kind of material you're looking to collect back in, or the material that you're looking to kind of be more engaged with more generally? So I think it goes in both directions. I think if you're really sort of accidentally finding a small portion of something that is not super useful for the big picture of the project, you have to make some occasionally hard choices. But I think there's also value in not necessarily pulling those things out unless you think it's really going to skew some kind of large scale picture down the line too. I don't know. It depends really on what the project looks like. I mean, if you have 5 out of 99, if you have 5 out of 99,000 documents, like that's not huge. But if you have 5 out of 60 documents, maybe it matters more.
Okay, so here's a question from Roshana. You talked about the problem of paywalls. At the moment, a lot of publishers and repositories are making content available freely because of COVID-19, which my students are so grateful for. I was really actually kind of touched at their sort of how crestfallen they were when they realized they cannot go into the library. What do you mean we can't go into the library? I can't go into the stacks. Yes. So given that we have now all kinds of content available freely because of COVID-19, do you have any advice about how to make the most of the moment?
Well, I have a piece of advice that is probably not good legal advice, which is to download as much as possible and see what you want to do with it later. But you never heard that from me. Sorry, all
this is being recorded, Heather.
I know. But I also think that there is a real value in kind of pitching to your librarian and saying, you know, these materials have really made my work easier to do. And I would love if we could get into some kind of partnership where us and a couple other institutions might collectively buy into those kinds of materials, for example. I know that our library has been, you know, again, much like you guys, sort of rapidly expanding access temporarily. And it seems like there might be a good case to say, okay, well, you know, now that we're using this all the time, it's going to be hard to go back without it. Could we start to allocate some budgets? That said, as we all know, libraries spend a lot of time going, we don't have money for anything. We can't buy anything new. Oh my God, please don't make us buy anything new. So on the one hand, yes, on the one hand, no. I think, you know, this is a good moment to try and get as much stuff as you can that you see as being valuable. And I think on the other hand, you can make a very strong case for why we might need these things down the line ultimately. Again, our legal eagles are going to be very unhappy with me for saying that, but I think there's a real value in sort of making the case for what it is that you're doing with it and why it would become an immediate necessity. Also, I agree with you that I was really shocked to see all the students like, but the library, it is my lifeblood. Like, oh, great. Okay. So glad to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and I would second your point without any endorsement of any illegal activity, that if you have a bunch of texts on hand that you can do a project with, that makes it a lot easier to make the case why you need to be able to do that project legitimately. So ProQuest has, of course, the congressional hearings, and so I didn't really know how to get at those except by scraping them through the library. We have access to them through the library, and so I scraped them or a sample of them, and I did a project on that, and then I presented it at a conference, and I went to the ProQuest guy who was in the book exhibit, and I was like, "Look what I made! Here's my poster." And he was like, "How did you do? Where did you get that stuff?" But the upshot of it was that I don't know if the fact that I'd done that helped, but then later, Thea was able to negotiate with them to get me legitimate access to that data, and now I can do that work without having to sort of hide it. Right? So I think making that case, yeah.
Yeah, and definitely talk to your acquisitions people, because I know at Penn State we have someone wonderful. His name is Jamie Jameson, who works really closely with the vendors to really negotiate access for this kind of text and data mining initiatives. It's definitely worth asking, hey, is there someone who can help me negotiate some agreements to get some stuff while it's still here? Okay, legal eagles, I'm no longer in trouble, but I still might be, A. And B, I think it's also worth kind of thinking through, if I really do need this material to do this kind of work, how would I get this under normal circumstances? What would that look like too? And I think you can also start to think about finding collaborators who might have access to it and saying, oh, I'm really interested in working on this thing with you. And not just you have the access to it, but I would love to work on this thing with you for this reason.
Yeah.
I think your work on X is really interesting. And I think we both bring something really compelling to this kind of landscape. One of the downsides of working with vendor materials is that they are very expensive, and they are often in these walled gardens. And I think that there's both value to them, but also a high cost to pay. I mean, you don't want to know how much some of these things cost. The first time you see those bills, your jaw falls to the floor for sure.
Okay, so I've got one more question here, and we can accommodate, I think, one or two more after this one. So feel free to chat me more questions or raise your hand. So this is from Sarah Buchanan. She's saying, can you talk about presenting or publishing projects at various stages of being done? And this, again, I think this is a really good question. So I'll second that.
What makes a digital project done is a really hard question. And I almost want to throw it back to Sarah and ask her what she thinks makes something done versus something that is incomplete. But I think that's cruel, so I'm not going to do that to Sarah. One way to talk about projects that are in process has been talking about it in terms of, this is a changing, a very mutable project. Like, things can change it's malleable, things can change between now and tomorrow. Maybe a couple months, slightly more than a couple months ago, I gave a talk at the University of Michigan libraries, which is where HathiTrust in part is largely based. And I gave them a lot of the same talk I just gave you about this African-American corpus as data, collections as data project. And they were really floored to hear that I was coming up with these problems with their faceting structure, in which they had all these different things kind of laid out. I'm like, oh, we hadn't thought about this. Okay, right? Like, we have some work to do to kind of revisit this. And I was like, oh, that's cool, but don't change it for me. I can keep working on this in these different ways. And one of the things that kind of comes up over and over again is talking about the fact that these are findings, but they are preliminary findings. They are in process findings. One of the things I did with the Anna Julia Cooper letter is still very much in process. We're not done with that yet. We're not going to be done with that for a very long time. So I think it's worth thinking about what that might look like way down the line, and kind of talking about it as a process of learning how to engage with these materials as we get to know them better and better.
Here's one from Thea. So what about, if you can share any insights about how you think about and address any silences in the data that you're working with, given that unfortunately our archives are not a complete record of all human history?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we found with HathiTrust, right? We're missing a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, we have to talk about it. There's no way to not talk about it. And as historians, all of you sitting here who are historians, you know that you have to talk about this. and you bring it up in various formats and say, well, we're missing this year, or we have a gap here, or I wish we had this, but it comes up all the time. And I think they have to really talk about it in the same way that we as scholars would talk about it, as historians, literary scholars, cultural historians, anything like that, labor historians. The kinds of silences end up being really complicated sometimes because, for example, it might be that we don't have the records from the NAACP from 1 year in Michigan for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe those no longer exist. It's entirely possible that someone threw them all out 1 year. That's complicated. Like, we may never be able to recover those things. And it's really, I don't want to say that it's really quite something, but I think it's worth thinking through what those things may be missing. And in many ways, I think computers are really good at making us think about absences way more than they are good at making us think about presences. We can see what's in a corpus. We can see what's in a collection. That's kind of easy, but thinking about what's not there is way harder.
Okay. All right. Any final questions?
We'll find out if
You
I'm
can
getting
also
sued now.
Sorry?
We're finding out if I'm getting sued now by our legal folks.
Well, it's all in the name of scholarship, so I think that makes it okay.
It's messy. I'm sorry, other librarians, I have failed us today.
But I think, in some ways, it's really kind of emblematic of and in some ways that's partly what also makes this moment so interesting, that we're discovering all kinds of things are being changed that well, if they can be changed now, were they really ever necessary in the first place? Like, so I think in some ways the copyright issues are along the same lines, that maybe we could expand fair use much more than we are doing
our
now.
Discussions about fair use being expanded under the guise of COVID-19. Brandy Carl and a couple other major libraries around the US for sure have done a whole bunch of work thinking about how this could be expanded. They have a really great document that was out in the ARL newsletter, I want to say. So I would really recommend looking at that. Copyright responses to COVID-19 is, I think, what it's called. But there's definitely discussions around it, and it's a very active, ongoing discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so silver linings.
Maybe.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. This was really fantastic, and I'm so pleased we could do this.
Well,
even if we couldn't do it.
Thank you guys so much for joining me today. It was a real pleasure to talk to all of you.
All right, I have unmuted everybody so we can pod. All right, thank you.
Thank you guys. All soon. Have a great evening.